Great. So it's about a minute past 6:30 now, so we'll get started. So welcome everybody to Private Woodlots, contributing to Canada's 30 by 30 target. My name is Olivia Foster, and I'm the Communications Coordinator with the Ontario Woodlot Association. I'm joined by my colleague Ben Gwillim, who's the Private Lands Inventory Analyst, also with the Ontario Woodlot Association, as well as Jeff Trescott. And Jeff is the Environmental Programs Coordinator at the Canadian Wildlife Service within the Ontario region. Canadian Wildlife Service is a branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada, and Jeff will be here to help us answer some questions this evening after the presentation. Thanks for joining us, Jeff.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Olivia. I just wanted to say, extend my thanks and greetings to everybody who's participating tonight. I'm looking forward to the presentation that they've been working towards, and we'll be interested to hear if there are any questions that might be able to help with at the end of the presentation.
Great, thanks, Jeff. I'm not sure, Ben, if you're able to change the next slide or if it might just be stuck at the moment there. Okay, perfect. Great. So just a couple housekeeping items to start with. Everyone's cameras and microphones are muted with the exception of the panelists. So Ben, Jeff, and I. During the Q&A session, we are able to unmute you if you would prefer to ask your question verbally rather than through the Q&A box. You can also find the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you are able to submit questions, you are able to submit questions throughout the presentation, but we won't answer them until the end. If you see a question you would like to see answered, you can click the upvote button to send it to the top of the question list. There is also a chat box, but we just ask that questions be submitted through the Q&A feature. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded, so the presentation can be shared with those who are unable to attend. So just going over the agenda here, we will provide a brief overview of Canada's National Biodiversity Strategy before diving into the 30 by 30 target. Ben will then go through the various components of the project, including the inventory, the Canadian Protected and Conserved Area Database, and then we'll get into a little bit more of what's involved with the screening. And we'll also touch on some opportunities and expectations for landowners who participate in the screening portion of the project. And we will also provide next steps for landowners who are interested in the screening. And then there will be some time remaining at the end for a Q&A period. So the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, the UNCBD, began in 1993 and is comprised of nearly 200 parties, including Canada. As an international, legally binding treaty, the Convention on Biological Diversity commits the parties to conserve biodiversity. Parties are required to have a national biodiversity strategy and action plan that outlines domestic efforts to advance the measures set out in the Convention on Biological Diversity. After signing the agreement, Canada has developed several strategies over the years, each building upon the previous, which are listed there on the slides. But I'll just highlight the most recent targets. So in 2016, Canada established the 2020 Biodiversity Goals and Targets for Canada. The target was to conserve 17% of terrestrial area and inland water and 10% of marine and coastal area of Canada by 2020. Then in 2020, Canada committed to conserving 25% of terrestrial and marine areas by 2025. And then in 2022, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was established, a new suite of biodiversity goals and targets, with the goal, of course, of protecting and conserving 30% of terrestrial, marine, and coastal areas by 2030. A major focus of the framework's mission is to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. And Canada's 2030 biodiversity strategy actually contains a total of 23 targets, but for this project, we're focusing on target 3. So at the end of the presentation, we'll have a list of resources, including the government website that highlights the 23 targets, But for the remainder of the presentation, we'll generally refer to target 3 as the 30 by 30 target. Now, within Canada's 2030 biodiversity strategy, the goal of Target 3 is to ensure that by 2030, at least 30% of terrestrial, marine, and coastal areas are effectively conserved and managed in Canada. The internationally aligned mechanism for accounting the area that contribute to Target 3 is through protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, also referred to as OECMs, which we'll explain further on the next slide. Now, there are a few similarities and differences between protected areas and OECMs. So some of the similarities is that they both require clearly defined boundaries. Both are an effective means to prevent harm to biodiversity, and protection is year-round, long-term, and difficult to reverse. Both are also managed in a way that achieves conservation outcomes. Now, getting a little bit into the differences, protected areas are those in which biodiversity conservation is the primary objective, and biodiversity is prioritized over other uses of that area. Some examples that come to mind are national and provincial and territorial parks, Indigenous protected areas, national wildlife reserves, and marine protected areas. OECMs, on the other hand, are areas where conservation isn't necessarily the primary objective, but it is still effectively achieved. A few examples of OECMs have included military bases and research stations used by post-secondary institutions. So the map here is showing the percentage of area across Canada that is protected or conserved as of December 2022, with data from the Canadian Protected and Conserved Area Database. We'll be referring to this as CPCAD. Protected terrestrial area is in the green, and you can see that was at 13.6% at the end of 2022. And then the marine protected areas is in blue, and that was at 14.7%. As you can see, there is an opportunity to account for land in Southern Ontario, and much of the land in Southern Ontario is predominantly privately owned.
Great. Okay, thanks, Olivia. I'll take over at this point. I'm going to be talking about the project broken down into its two primary components. And I want to differentiate between these two because their participation differs quite greatly. The first is the forested area inventory. And that is the aspect of the project that everyone who has participated in the questionnaire will be involved in. And what this is essentially we are measuring, well, we'd like to measure the total forested area, which is on our members' woodlots. What this will be used for is to understand the potential in Ontario for inclusion of these woodlots within the CPCAD as an OECM or other effective area-based conservation measure. From that, we're going to select a sample of the woodlots for the actual screening process. And this aspect of the project is entirely voluntary, whether you've participated in the first aspect or not. And what this is we'll be undergoing, or they'll be undergoing a screening process undertaken by the OWA, and then we can see if it's possible that these woodlots could be included in the CPCAD. And I'm going to talk a little more about that. First, the forested inventory area, forest area inventory. Basically, at this point, nothing will be published to any public database. All information collected as part of this aspect of the project remains for internal project use only. That means only the OWA will have access to the information that you've provided us with the location of your woodlots or your parcel roll numbers, including your contact information. And we will use that to map the forested areas of your woodlots. Essentially, I'll be going through and looking at imagery of where you've identified where your woodlots are. I will map just the forested portion of those woodlots and compile a database with only the spatial location and the certification status of your woodlot. So certification being either a FSC, Forest Stewardship Council certification, or an SFI certification, or if you have another one, CFA or something, or CSA or something like that. But essentially, that's the only information that's shared with the ECCC is the spatial information of your woodlot and the certification status. All data that's collected will, of course, be encrypted and won't be hosted in the cloud anywhere. It's kept offline and quite safe. So really what the objective of this portion of the project is to account for what is the total forested area of Ontario's privately held and managed woodlots. This is something which is currently actually unknown by the provincial government, federal government, and even by our own organization. We can only make educated guesses based on estimates and average sizes and the amount of members or the amount of landowners, but really no one has undertaken something which would delineate and map the actual total amount of privately held forested woodlots in Ontario. So this is an example of what the inventory will look like. It's really basically this. We're just accounting for area of forest and certification status. And that is what's shared with the ECCC. And this is what's used to build our forest areas inventory. Moving on from that aspect of it is the inclusion of your woodlot into the CPCAD, or the Canadian Protected and Conserved Areas database. So if you have chosen the option of being contacted for screening, your information from the previous inventory would then carry over and be used in the screening process in a sort of elevated, we take a bit more of a microscopic look at your property. So first, what is the CPCAD? Well, it's an authoritative source, meaning that all of the data within that source is verified to be accurate and can be used to inform policy and decision-making, at all levels of government. It's accessible and available to all those on the web. So it's hosted on the Open Science Data Platform, which is hosted by the federal government, and that's anybody can go in there and download any sort of scientific data that's been publicly funded, and this data set would be available on there as well. It's contributed nationwide, so it's managed by the ECCC, but of course, federal, provincial, territorial governments, NGOs, there's Indigenous groups, and of course CAs all contribute data to this. And I believe this will be the first time, I'm not sure nationally if there's ever been private woodlot owners contributing to this database. So that's pretty exciting that we're able to be the first. So again, and also it's internationally aligned. So what that means is that these fit the standards that can be used to publish. When you read these reports by the UN and they say how much, what percentage of our forested areas across the world is being conserved, your information in this database would go towards some of those percentages, even however small it would be. It's still very cool that that meets that standard, or your property would meet that standard, and can be included in some of these figures internationally. So this is just some of the use cases for the CPCAD. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they're just some examples nationally. What it's used for, of course, is for the 30 by 30 project. They use it for the environmental sustainability indicators. They reference the CPCAD for protected area status reports, census and environments. These big federal reports that you see come out, they use this authoritative source for their figures. Internationally, it's used by the United Nations and World Commissions on protected areas. It also provides baseline information for a lot of very big initiatives for conservation planning and of course for research and academia research and whatnot. Sorry. If you'd like to access the CPCAD, the simplest way is to go into Google and just Google CPCAD. And that's your first hit that comes up. Open that link. And of course, that link will provide you with a lot of background information on the CPCAD. But if you'd like to see what it actually looks like, scroll down to the bottom to related links and click on the Open Maps Data Viewer. And what you'll be presented with is a spatial sort of Google Maps interface that you can move around and zoom in and out of. And you can click on any one of these green polygons, and each of them contain the data that would be public, that would be published as part of that database. And you can see on the left, that's just the table of information that's included. And a lot of it is just, the area of forest that's being protected or the area that's conserved, the year is established, the year that it qualified for the CPCAD, the type of area it is, the type of biome, ownership. Your name wouldn't be on the ownership type. The ownership type would be a sort of generic title. In this case, it's a nonprofit organization, so the Nature Conservancy of Canada. In this case, I'm not sure what the title would be, but of course, some ownership information is going to be present. As well, any links to management plans that would be present on the property would also be in this table. So you could click on any one of these polygons and it'll come up with a different set of information specific to that conserved area. Looking at Ontario, so when we zoom out and we see a summary table is generated for all the provinces. So you can see here where Ontario sits, and it's 10.9% right now in conserved areas. So we got a big way to go. But what's interesting is Ontario has very low of the OECMs. So you look at Saskatchewan with 12,000 and British Columbia with 38,000. We're sitting at 43. So the OWA membership having their contribution here would really boost these numbers up, and I think that's excellent. So again, this aspect of the project, being a part of the CPCAD screening process, is entirely voluntary, whether you'd like to be measured as part of the initial inventory or not. You do have to be evaluated using a decision support tool, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And that's undertaken all by the OWA. There's really there's not much participation on your part. You would just have to provide some information about your property, about the management on your property, answer a few questions, but no one would have to visit your property or audit anything like that. It's just it's very we just kind of provide the criteria you have to meet, and then we see if you can meet it, and we do that through a series of questions. So it's only a sample of the respondents. We're not going to be doing all OWA membership at this point. This is just to see if this is a viable path that we can include woodlots as OECMs, and what kind of impact is that going to have on Canada's Target 3. And again, yes, so screening was conducted by the OWA, and it won't require a site visit on our part. So this is the decision support tool. It's just a set of criteria developed for meeting this target. And it has just a series of questions that are surrounding these topics you see here in the middle. So the location and boundaries of the site, is it a defined area that can be conserved, right? Like in most properties are, because you have a property line. So what are the objectives of the management plan, and is that conducive to conservation on this specific site? Are there governing authorities of the site? What's the ownership like? What type of activities are expected to occur in the future, right? So what's the future direction that the site's going to take? Is it going to continue to be conserved perpetually? What are the existing legislations and regulations and any sort of other conservation instruments that exist on the property? Are they present? And what's the overall ecological condition of the site? And these are all the questions that are asked, and it's just basically a do you meet this or you do you not meet it? And you can go through the decision support. I encourage you to visit this website, and it's easy enough to Google CPCAD decision support tool. Click on the first two links, will take you to the same document, and you can go through yourself and you can see the different criteria and the specific action. And there's only maybe, you know, a couple dozen questions that they're not really questions, they're more like it's just like it's a criteria that you have to meet or you don't meet. So I really encourage you to go through that and see for yourself what and we're going to talk a bit more about the standard itself, but to see the wording yourself, you can do that easily. It's all online posting. So moving on to the standard criteria, did you want me to go through this too, Olivia?
That's okay, Ben.
Or did you have the notes on this one?
I've got some notes here, but if you want to
Okay.
add anything, feel free to chime in.
Sure.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so moving on to the standard, you can find more about this in the decision support tool, but we'll just go through some of the questions that are asked in it just to provide a little bit more information. So we're going to review a few of the critical components for screening, starting with clearly defined boundaries. So all of these standard criteria, again, are outlined in the decision support tool. And a way to determine or a way to show that the boundaries are clearly defined is by providing registered deeds or titles to the land. And boundaries are demarcated by maps, survey markers, etc., which are then mapped by GIS. Now you'll see some terminology if you scroll through the decision support tool about the governing authority. And in this case, as a private landowner, you would be the governing authority. And so the governing authority to screen as an OECM, or in other cases, a protected area, must be motivated to protect the area. So this is going to be guided by goals and objectives of the site. And you would also be wanting to see sustainable management of the site. So in the case of the woodlot, that potentially could look like a MIFTIP, a managed forest tax incentive program for the property for certification. Not to say that these are the only things, or that if you have these two things, that it would contribute to checking off this box, but those are just a couple examples. So there are effective means to control incompatible activities which are likely to negatively impact biodiversity. Because of course, the idea of the OECM is to conserve biodiversity. So an incompatible activity, just to kind of go through a little bit more information about what an incompatible versus a compatible activity might be. So an activity that's incompatible would be one that has effects that prevent or negatively affect biodiversity conservation, or they compromise the area's objectives or outcomes, which are supposed to be around biodiversity. Potentially compatible activities would be an activity if managed effectively. So that could mean limited in scale, intensity, extent, etc. That would not compromise in situ, so in site conservation. And then a compatible activity would be an activity that does not compromise conservation, regardless of the scale, intensity, extent of which it occurs. So you can think of things in the context of a woodlot, perhaps different scales of harvesting, or sometimes some other examples would include tourism on a site. So how intensive that activity is. And effective means would be potentially legislative or regulatory measures that inhibit a non-compatible activity. So for an example, to provide additional information about an activity that has a negative impact would be one that's environmentally damaging. So perhaps industrial activities and infrastructure. Now, of course, there's no guarantee that a protected area or OECM will be in place forever. But the intention is for them to be in place for the long term and not to be easily reversed. So long-term meaning an intent of permanent protection / conservation, which may be achieved in a variety of ways, and not easily reversed, meaning that the conservation mechanisms are likely to endure over the long term due to difficulty involved in rescinding them. So a potential example for a landowner might be a conservation easement. And of course, as we've already mentioned, biodiversity conservation is a key objective of both the protected area and the OECM. All relevant governing bodies or authorities need to be on board with the objectives and management that result in biodiversity conservation on the site. So that could be if there's multiple landowners, or if your property, if there's an agreement with, for instance, a land trust or a conservation authority, everybody needs to be on the same page. So just to provide a few examples of protected areas and OECMs, groups throughout Canada are using the decision support tool to identify areas that may contribute to the 30 by 30 target. And the places listed on the screen there have cases that are available online with completed templates for areas that have qualified as a protected area or an OECM, with the exception of Northumberland County Forest, which is an asterisk. That is a project by Ontario Nature that's not currently available online, but it's a great example. So why get involved in screening? Ben had mentioned a few examples, and what I want to emphasize again is that it's really a concrete way to take meaningful action. Your conservation efforts would be counting towards federal targets, and the screening process follows internationally aligned standards for screening as protected areas and OECMs. Further beyond that, Canada's contribution is included in the World Database on Protected Areas. However, we do want to stress as well that every step of the program is voluntary. And then in addition to creating a meaningful action, landowners' involvement also supports research into expanding the Canadian Protected Area Network, as well as informing integrated conservation planning and protecting species at risk. And protecting at-risk species and habitat. Overall, recognizing the biodiversity benefits from the way private lands are managed gives us more complete information about our collective conservation network, which will help everybody make better land management decisions. And lastly, there's also recognition for your contribution. It's really an opportunity to lead the path for private landowners protecting biodiversity in Ontario. For commercial woodlots, there would be recognition, or your recognition could potentially contribute to your product's brand and reinforce community values regarding conservation, environmental protection, sustainable land use, and particularly in the context of climate change. So we're quite pleased to see that there's been a lot of interest expressed thus far. But we want to ensure that all interested landowners are clear about the expectations associated with the project. So the main expectation for any landowner that undergoes the entire screening process and decides to include lands in the Canadian Protected and Conserved Areas Database, the CPCAD, is that biodiversity on the land is protected and maintained or improved. However, the inclusion of lands in the CPCAD is strictly voluntary. In order to include lands in the CPCAD, as we had mentioned, the screening process is undertaken to ensure that the land meets the definition of the OECM. And landowners or managers who agree to participate in the screening process would again be working with OWA staff to provide information, such as the long-term management intent for the site and any conservation mechanisms. Once an area is recognized, participating in the CPCAD doesn't result in any additional policy or regulatory restrictions on the property. However, to be recognized, all criteria in the screening process must be met. Including that management will ensure that conservation will continue in the long term on the property. And then additionally, there are no obligations to change the management of the site at any point. Excuse me. So just a few next steps we wanted to inform people about before we dive into the Q&A session is that we did send out a questionnaire in mid-October. Any woodlot owner in Ontario, not just OWA members who are interested in completing the questionnaire, can do so. I'll be putting my email in the chat, and it's also available on ontariowoodlot.com. And like I said, we'll put our email and contact information in the chat so everybody can get access to that questionnaire. We're planning on trying to wrap that up around mid-December. And we'll also be sending out a preliminary screening to everybody who consented in the original questionnaire, the initial questionnaire, that they would be agreeable to being contacted about the screening process. So that'll be somewhat of a preliminary screening to determine what kind of conservation tools folks have for their property and to confirm interest in potentially screening their property. And landowners will be contacted for screening around early to mid-January. So we just have a few key references here. We have mentioned a few references throughout the presentation this evening, and we can share those with anybody who's interested. So we just wanted to thank Environment and Climate Change Canada for the project funding, and as well to Jeff Truscott on the webinar for joining us today and for providing guidance.